Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is another part of our series that we're running on the drug war and why this horrific government program should be ended. As many of you know, the mission of the Future of Freedom Foundation is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the libertarian philosophy. And as part of that mission, ever since our inception in 1989, we have called for an end to the federal war on drugs. And so we put together this series of presenters giving their perspectives on why the drug war is a bad thing, why it should be ended. And I'm pleased to have as our presenter today, David Stockman. David was a U.S. congressman back in the 1980s, and he left Congress to become the director of the Office of Management and Budget under the Reagan administration. He was one of the responsible people there. When he left, he wrote a fantastic book called The Triumph of Politics, Why the Reagan Revolution Failed, which is certainly pertinent reading to everybody joining the Trump administration today. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, he wrote another great book called The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America, which details how we went from a free market economic system to one of crony capitalism. And his newest book, which I highly recommend, is Trumped, A Nation on the Brink of Ruin and How to Bring It Back. He has a fantastic website called Contra Corner that I'd recommend to you. In fact, he's got a great article on the drug war. It's probably one of the best expositions on why we need to end this horrific government program. And it's entitled How to Drain the Swamp, End the Failed War on Drugs. So, David, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on and sharing your perspectives on draining the swamp by ending the war on drugs.
Well, very happy to join, and I feel very strongly about this topic and have for the last 50 years because I was actually a staffer on Capitol Hill in 1971 when Nixon gave his infamous speech declaring the war on drugs and denouncing illicit drugs as public enemy number one and all the rest. But if we look at what's transpired in the 50 years since then, it's pretty appalling, and it puts you in mind of that famous dictum attributed to Einstein that says if you keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result, you're definitionally insane. Now, we have a view that this is none of the government's business in the first place. The philosophically correct position is that what people do in their private lives, what they use for sedatives or intoxicants or recreation or other pleasures is their business. It's not the government. The war on drugs never should have been started. But even if you set that aside and just say, as a practical matter, has it changed anything? The answer is unequivocally no. According to most of the studies that have tried to accumulate all that's being spent on this, pointless campaign at state, local, and federal levels, it's something like 1.5 trillion since 1971. But we could look at three measures of public behavior that I think demonstrate pretty clearly that it's had no impact whatsoever in terms of its stated goals, and then we can get to all of the collateral damage and really destructive effects that inevitably result when you try prohibition or to make something the public wants contraband. But the point is, if you look at one measure that's been taken over and over year by year since then, the rate of drug use by high school seniors in the last month, it's a standard measure, that has not varied at all between 25 and 30% for the last 30 or 40 years, despite all of this government spending and enforcement and education efforts and all the rest. Another measure is use of illicit drugs by the population as a whole or population over 12 years of age. that ratio has stood at about 8 to 9% for decades. In fact, after all of this time, it's actually crept up a little bit. And then, even if you look at serious addiction rates, that is oscillated around 1.5% of the population. So the point is, after all of this effort and all of the machinery that's been created, the Drug Enforcement Administration didn't exist when Nixon came over the TV that day. And frankly, I was a young kid then, 24 years of age or so, and it made me a little nervous because I was the marijuana distributor in our congressional office. So, but the point was, it didn't have any impact on my particular behavior or any behavior of people who were in the privileged parts of society and life, like myself. It basically has come down hard on urban areas and poor people and black people in America and so forth. So the point is that we have all this machinery. The DEA, as I said, didn't exist. Now it has a budget of $3.5 billion and something like 14,000 employees, 12,000 agents. None of them should even be on the government payroll or even exist. Now, the reason that I bring all this up is I think it is a superb lesson in how difficult it is to drain the swamp. Because once a inappropriate purpose of government is embraced on a bipartisan basis, and clearly the war on drugs has been, and Nixon, of course, started the whole thing, and I'll talk in a minute about how it got escalated quite substantially during the Reagan-Bush era when I was there. But once you get in bipartisan embrace, then the thing just grows by topsy. If you look at the budget today for the so-called federal drug strategy, it's $30 billion a year, of which about 16 billion is for enforcement. The other half is for treatment. But if we look at the enforcement part, we can see that virtually every agency of the federal government has got its nose under the tent one way or another. Of course, you would expect the Justice Department to be there with the FBI and the DEA, but there is huge expenditures that occur in the court system and the U.S. Marshal system. We have all of the domestic agencies, education, even HUD has some kind of anti-drug program. The State Department has a huge piece of the action in terms of international interdiction. There's over $1.5 billion of this monster we call the defense budget that's also directed towards interdiction, drug enforcement, and so forth. And you could count down the line even more. So my point is that all of these different programs and agencies have different congressional authorizing committees, appropriations committees, constituencies, and once they all get in the act and the bipartisan consensus is formed, then despite everybody's best intention, and this is what we're hearing from the Trump administration elect today, the swamp becomes very difficult to drain. When I took over as budget director in 1981, the war on drugs was just getting off the ground. The total budget was about $1.5 billion. We had come to Washington, or so we thought, to drain the swamp. And it's a little ironic about what happened over the next 12 years of Reagan-Bush to the anti-drug budget, the war on drugs. It soared to $12.5 billion during that 12-year period, an 18% compound annual rate of growth, because there was a faction within the Reagan apparatus that believed it was a heck of a good political issue to go after, illicit drugs and to prosecute the war on drugs, and then it evolved into this insanity with minimum sentences that, for minor possession that are really almost cruel in unusual punishment. So my point in mentioning this is that once it got embraced by the Republicans who were supposed to understand these things, A, what's the role of government? This isn't it. B, when you tamper with a free market, you're going to get, feedback effects that are the opposite of what you intend. And clearly, what's happened here is that we've created a massive global criminal enterprise to take over what had previously been distribution in the normal free market channels of commerce. The difference, of course, between Philip Morris or Merck and the criminal underground is enormous amounts of violence and enormous amounts of harm to the very communities that allegedly these programs are trying to protect. So you can't really think of a bigger failure in terms of the federal government and in terms of domestic policies since the 1960s, really. And yet, the damage that's being done day after day as this continues is really monumental and pretty terrible. I point out in the blog that you mentioned that when all this started, there were less than 40,000 people in prisons and jails throughout the United States on drug charges, and today that's 500,000. More than 1.3 million people, or 1.4, I guess, million, are arrested on drug charges every year. 84% of those are for possession. A high fraction end up in convictions and incarceration. And what these incarcerations do, in my judgment, is simply compound the crime problem that we do have, because as we know, prisons and jails are training schools for criminals, and we're putting millions of people through those training schools because they possess minor amounts of marijuana or cocaine or other illicit drugs. It's really kind of crazy, but it's a measure of how difficult it is to drain the swamp once these enterprises get underway.
All right, I think your arguments can be summarized in within three different areas. The philosophical case that you mentioned, the failure of the drug war itself to achieve its own purported ends, but that it's also not just a neutral failure. It actually has enormous negative consequences that are come with it. Let's go back to the philosophical case. Why do you think that a person's drug use or drug distribution, why do you think that's not a legitimate function of government to take care of people and to protect them from these bad choices? We all know that drugs can be very harmful. We know that they can destroy families. People get addicted to them. Some of them die from them. Why shouldn't the role of government include protecting people in this way by incarcerating them if they are engaged in drug addiction or drug distribution?
Well, that's a good question, but I think it's pretty basic. People do, unfortunately, a lot of things that may be harmful to themselves, either in the short run or the long run. Alcohol, tobacco, skydiving, reckless driving. I'm out here in Aspen where we spend the winter, and there are all these snowboarders up in the mountains doing absolutely reckless and crazy things. So, if we accept that in a free society, people have the fundamental liberty to make choices for the better or for worse, as long as they do not directly harm third parties or other people in terms of their safety and lives and property, that is a fundamental principle that you really need to sort of implant right in the center of your thinking, because once you deviate from that principle, where does it stop? What I learned over my period in Washington is that once you deviate from that principle, there are all these advocacy groups that can come along and make a heck of a case that skydiving is a highly dangerous sport and it needs to be banned, or many other endeavors of that sort that would be easy to name. So I think it's very clear. People have to have the liberty in a free society to make good choices, productive choices for themselves, their families, but also if they make questionable choices or bad choices, that's all part of the freedom business. Once we deviate very far from that, we have a government that can't help itself, a government that becomes, as a lot of people call it, and I strongly believe it's the case, the nanny state that has the potential for endless meddling and interference in our lives. I also live in New York City, and you can remember Mayor Bloomberg banning the 16-ounce, soft drinks on the grounds that people were making themselves fat. Well, of course they were, but it wasn't his business to tell people that they had to buy two 8-ounce, containers of soft drink rather than 16. It's a pretty slippery slope. I've experienced or learned over the years. Once you start down that path of protecting people, adult people, from their own decisions.
Well, you spent a lot of time in Washington, and you've written these books on how to drain the swamp there. And what is the mindset of the standard nanny state advocate? I mean, when you talk to these people, what is it that they express as to why they favor this war on drugs? What is it? What is it that drives them? You say it's very difficult to drain the swamp once the program gets established, but we're dealing with people here. What is it that they express to you as to why this thing should be continued?
Well, there's a number of things. Part of it is nothing more than inertia, the recency bias. These programs have been on the books and have been expanding, incrementally, a few $1 billion a year for so long that most of the players in the system, the staff, members of the relevant congressional committees, um, don't really rethink the fundamentals. Why are we doing this? There's this whole thing we had a while back that's been totally lost called zero-based budgeting. It's kind of a pipe dream, but at least it had the virtue of saying every now and then you got to go back to basics and not say, should the budget go from 1.5 billion to 1.7? But why do we have the budget at all? What purpose of legitimate purpose of government are we furthering? And is it working? And is this a good way to put a burden on taxpayers who are struggling all over the United States to make ends meet, let alone the 20 trillion of debt that we're piling on to future generations? But none of that happens. The inertia grinds forward. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a partisan angle to it. Nobody, once the predicate was established that the war on drugs was, a good thing, and that it was necessary to combat, one kind of evil or another that came from the various proscribed drugs. Then, Republicans in particular didn't want to be accused of being soft on crime and drugs, and the Democrats were happy to compete for votes and to compete on the issue. And whenever you have a bipartisan consensus, as I said a while ago, look out below because, there is no way to stop the machine from grinding forward. Finally, you have all of the interest groups and the constituencies that get established once these programs get underway. I was trying to mention very quickly how many different agencies, and there are literally dozens and dozens of agencies that have jumped on the bandwagon since 1971 for their piece of the war on drugs. And as a result of that, you have this tremendous amount of lobbying from groups that support these programs and from all the agencies involved as they come to the Hill day after day for their authorizations and appropriations legislation. In other words, the government creates its own machinery, its own infrastructure of self-perpetuation. And when you have, as I mentioned a moment ago, just at the federal level, 30 billion of spending right now for drug treatment and enforcement spread through dozens of agencies. That machine is like a what do you call it, perpetual motion machine in itself that drives the process forward. The final thing is we have basically denuded the process by which, at least when I was there in the early 1980s, the government at least had to make some priorities and allocations and recognize that on the fiscal front, you're always dealing with scarce resources and that you can't fund everything. But what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years is they just put the budget process aside. In 1981, no one would have thought you could go for a full year without a budget. Now it happens year after year, and no one thinks otherwise. Back then, we took the debt ceiling seriously, and so therefore you knew if you didn't control the annual deficit, you were going to be piling on to the national debt. You were going to need to raise the debt ceiling. That was a traumatic thing to do politically. And so therefore there was another force towards restraint. Well, today they actually exempted, and it was done, frankly, by a Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner, whose name should go down in infamy for doing this on his parting shot, as he was essentially drummed out of the Republican caucus. But that deal he made in October a year ago, 2015, to basically put the debt ceiling on hold. In other words, declare a holiday and that the government could borrow as much as it wants without even having to ask the Congress for a debt ceiling increase and ask the members of Congress to be on the record and accountable and vote and show their constituencies where they stand. All of that was suspended. We borrowed about $2 trillion dollars in the interim. The national debt, when they face it again on March 15th, is going to be 20 trillion dollars, and it will be just another indication of how badly the machinery's failed. And I think this is important because if you don't have machinery, fiscal decision-making machinery that has the capacity to contain and force contain total spending and force choices, then you've got the worst of all possible worlds, and that's where we are in this idiotic war on drugs today. Now the problem is if you can't stop something as unsuccessful, unnecessary, unjustified as this $30 billion war on drugs, what part of the swamp is it that they're going to drain? And I think that's going to be the day of reckoning, as I call it, for the Trump administration. He's now appointed a really solid guy as budget director, Mick Mulvaney, but he's got a whole cabinet full of people that want to slash taxes, increase defense, increase veterans, have a big infrastructure program, don't touch Medicare, don't touch Social Security. This is a worse fiscal equation than the one that I had to deal with during the Reagan era. So, as I indicate, the theme of the moment is draining the swamp. A very good test case is the war on drugs. And if you look at it, I don't see a lot of prospect that even that part of the swamp is going to get any shallower in the years ahead, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is an absolutely fascinating point that if they can't get rid of a program or won't get rid of a program that is obviously a total failure and also has tremendous adverse consequences, what possibility exists for them to do it to other programs? Now, one of the fascinating statistics that you have in your article on the drug war on your site, Contra Corner, is that statistic that says that no, there's been no change. I mean, I would assume that would shock people in terms of drug use or drug possession. That nothing's really changed, and yet, despite all of these efforts, the mandatory minimum sentences, the filling up of the jails, the expansion of the budget. I mean, how do they justify such a thing when it's clear that that statistic that you cited, nothing's changed?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it just tells you how much Washington is on automatic pilot, that there is a bipartisan consensus in favor of the status quo. By some miracle, Trump got elected running against the status quo, and at least you can take some hope in that. At least it was a message, perhaps desperate, from the public that something's got to change here because we can see the economy is failing. Our standard of living is shrinking, and Washington keeps prospering, and the national debt keeps growing. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of the Fed and Wall Street. So the public said they're fed up. The question is, how can that be translated into action? How is it likely to be translated into action going forward? And I don't see a lot of hope that there's going to be any breakthroughs, but there will be a big collision. You know, there's all this talk about there's going to be a great Trump, stimulus. I think there's going to be a Trump fiscal bloodbath as all of these programs, like the one we're talking about here, grind higher, and the national debt keeps rising.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you're putting it in the larger context of the out of control spending and debt, because as you know, people on the left say, oh, this is all wonderful. They're spending more money, they're stimulating the economy. Well, you and I both know what debt and spending do to countries. We can look at Greece, we can look at Puerto Rico, we can look at cities in the United States, and we're looking at a very bad scenario. And yet here we have this program that is so enormously expensive, that has accomplished nothing, that is really destroying life and destroying society, and yet they don't want to touch it. But yet there's also some positive movements in this area. I mean, you recall the articles that Milton Friedman wrote back in Newsweek in '72 about the drug war, and then later in, I think it was '90, that open letter to Bill Bennett. I mean, and we libertarians were holding lonely ground back then, but there's been a sea change of public opinion, don't you think, on the drug war?
Oh, absolutely. As I say, I'm speaking today from Aspen, Colorado. So there's been a big change here. There's 9 other states now that have basically legalized recreational use. I think something like 27 states now have at least some opening or loophole for medical uses, at least of marijuana. If you look at the public opinion polls, they've shifted dramatically. And whereas, it was about 3 to 1 opposed to legalization 25 to 30 years ago, now the quite large majority is in favor. So, in a way, the people are way ahead of the government. And the interesting case here is that as these voter referendums register, election after election, will that be enough of a wake-up call to tell some of these politicians on the appropriations committees or in the congressional leadership or hopefully the Trump administration that we've got other fish to fry? We need to rethink from the bottom up this whole war on drugs and begin to dramatically de-escalate the enforcement and incarceration side of this. One number that I had in my article, which I found astounding, I don't believe as a federalist that the federal government needs to be in the law enforcement and crime business to begin with. There is no reason why under the 10th Amendment the states and the localities can't handle protection of property, protection of life and safety, legitimate policing functions on their own. Nevertheless, we got into the war on drugs and the war on crime and major federal involvement little by little over a long period of time. But it's startling to know that in the federal prison system today, there's something like 210,000 people living, in Uncle Sam's facilities, and half of those are on drug-related charges. That's astounding. Half of all the inmates in federal prisons today are there on drug-related charges, which tells you that the prison system is twice as big as it needs to be even before you start looking at some of the other causes. So maybe they'll wake up and be forced finally to say we've got to cut somewhere, and maybe the 105,000 people living under Uncle Sam's hospitality ought to be sent back to real life to function on their own.
Yeah, it would be an easy way to relieve a little bit of tension on the budget. But your question's an absolutely fascinating one. When I read it, I said, "Wow, this is awesome." Where you're questioning whether the federal government should be involved in law enforcement at all. I mean, what's the point of it when the states can be doing it? It's just providing jobs for federal bureaucrats, federal judges, federal clerks. And here's an easy way to get rid of really not only just a needless government program, but one that has been highly destructive.
Yeah,
Uh,
on that point, obviously we've way over criminalized our society and our laws enormously. But once the federal government got involved in law enforcement, the temptation for demagoguing congressmen to want to criminalize this, that, and the other thing became overwhelming. And since it became an accepted purpose of the federal government to get knee deep into criminal law and law enforcement, there was almost no stopping it. And so we have thousands and thousands of pages of federal criminal law having to do with things that really Washington shouldn't be involved in at all. The states know how to do, as I say, law enforcement and to protect property and life. And if we had not crossed that threshold, there would literally be thousands of federal laws and functions and tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that wouldn't be spent today on purposes that aren't even legitimate functions of the federal government.
yeah, you're raising two really fundamentally important questions that I think every American should be asking. One is, what should be the role of the federal government in our society? And two, what should be the role of government generally in people's lives?
Right.
And
It's kind of interesting historically how the federal government even got into law enforcement and criminal law. It came out of the end of World War One and the whole kind of hunt for subversives and Germans and unpatriotic people. That's where it started in the allegedly unpatriotic people. That's where it started in the Justice Department. Right after that, the Volstead Act passed prohibition, and the FBI was organized essentially as an institution to enforce prohibition. And finally, when people realized that prohibition of liquor was a huge failure and it was repealed in 1933, they were quick to discover reefer madness and all the other ills of what are today illicit drugs. In my post in Contra Corner, I have some pictures of products that used to be on the grocery shelves, including cannabis oil and a lot of other things that somehow the country was doing well. It was prospering. It was growing. It was peaceful. It was a great place. And yet all of these drugs that today will land you 10 years in jail for possessing were on the grocery shelves back before 1914. So, sometimes we need to recall our history, rethink how we've gotten to the absurd point that we are today. I opened the article by noting that the DEA was bragging that in 2010 it destroyed, I believe, 11 million marijuana plants. Well, bully for them. Over the previous 25 years, they had sort of patted themselves on the back for pulling 125 million marijuana plants from the soil and destroying them. Now, you think about that. Is there anything stupider? Is there anything more pointless for the federal government to do than what was being advertised in that chart that I reproduced in my blog? It's it's simply mind-boggling the way that these programs, these crusades get started, and we end up with some bureaucrats bragging that they've hoed out about 125 million wheats over a period of time. Crazy.
Yeah, and for what end? Since the nothing changes anyway, the
Yeah.
somebody else supplies the drug and prices go up. We're about out of time, but just give me your reason as to why you believe that ending the war on drugs will bring us a more peaceful society.
Well, because I think one of the biggest sources of violence today in our society on the borders, throughout our communities, especially in the big cities and urban areas, is the fact that all of these drugs could easily be distributed through vending machines or through pharmacies or through grocery stores operated by competitive, peaceful businesses. As I say, put Philip Morris in charge, buy the stuff at Walgreens and tax it. And, the point I make, and a lot of people are aware of it, is we spend overall, state, local, federal, about 50 billion a year on just enforcement. And the calculations are that if we reversed field and said, let's let Philip Morris take care of this, let normal channels of commerce handle it and tax it instead, if that's what you want to do. If you taxed the drugs on the proscribed list today, at their current level of use, at the same rate as alcohol and tobacco, it would generate 50 billion a year of revenue to the various levels of government. Now, how much more sensible would it be to end the violence, to undermine fundamentally the criminal underworld and cartels that are wreaking havoc in both communities and on our borders? How much more sensible would it be to have this done, as I say, by Philip Morris and collect taxes rather than, maimed, injured, and killed innocent citizens?
Okay, that's David Stockman, the author of the great new book, Trumped, A Nation on the Brink of Ruin and How to Bring It Back. Visit his website at Contra Corner. David, thank you very much for taking the time to come and share these excellent perspectives with us.
Very happy to do it.